Okay, hi there. Welcome to a video showing how you can use labour market diagrams in a variety of contexts. Now, the video is mainly for Edexcel, but I'm sure there'll be some great use for other exam boards as well. But check your specification to see which diagrams you need. For Edexcel, you basically just need labour demand and labour supply, and they can be applied to a variety of contexts. Let's start by looking at the economics of low pay. This chart, this table, shows the median full-time gross weekly pay of the lowest paid occupations in the UK back in 2023. Retail cashiers, checkout operators and childminders came bottom of that table. Full-time gross weekly pay in medium terms of less than £400 a week. And other occupations include bar staff, launderers, dry cleaners, teaching assistants and coffee shop workers. So we know there are many people who are low paid in the UK economy, many of them in the service sector. So what diagrams might we use to analyse pay differentials, for example, between different occupations? Again, for Edexcel, labour demand and supply is all that you need. Typically, the labour supply for retail workers, for example, is highly wage elastic at a relatively low wage. Employers don't have to increase the wage by too much in order to attract and retain the extra workers. And labour demand, which if you're studying other exam boards is a reflection of marginal revenue productivity, again that's fairly elastic at low wage rates. So we tend to get high employment but at low sort of average or median wages. Whereas for occupations such as data scientists, the labour supply is more wage inelastic. It starts at a higher reservation wage, and labour demand is also higher and more wage inelastic as well. So you can see here that the equilibrium wage, and this is a simplistic model clearly, but there is a clear gap in the equilibrium wage between people working in the retail sector and perhaps people working as data scientists. Now this diagram will be absolutely fine to help illustrate, analyse and evaluate the causes of wage differentials. Let's think about trade unions for a second. There are 34 million people in a paid job in the UK. A substantial proportion work as part-time employees. What percentage of them are members of a union? Have a guess. Well, the answer is less than 1 in 4. It's 22.4% using the 2023 data. And that figure, as you can see, has fallen sharply since 1995, when it was 33%, and all the way back to 1979, when it was over 50%. So the significant majority of people in work in the UK at present are not members of a trade union. So what kind of diagram can we use to analyse trade unions? Well, essentially the unions are using their collective bargaining power, representing their members, to try to drive the wage paid up. Let's take, for example, the car workers here, labour supply and labour demand, normal sort of equilibrium wage of W1. The main aim of a union is to negotiate a wage higher, if you like, than a free market competitive wage. And if they do that, then there's a risk, this is a risk, of a fall in employment from E1 to E2. So we talk about a wage premium for unions, that they might be able to negotiate a higher wage than might otherwise exist, but at the possible trade-off of a loss of jobs. But of course, a lot depends on the elasticity of labour demand. Now, what would be a good idea in the exam is to say, well, look, if labour demand such as LD2 is wage inelastic, you can see here the difference in the elasticity of the demand curves, then in theory that allows unions to negotiate that higher wage, but without quite as big of a fall in employment. And that would boost the incomes, the total incomes of union members. So unions have a greater collective bargaining power when the demand for labour is wage inelastic. Think about the reasons why that might be the case. And also when they represent a high percentage of people employed in the industry. But they can't necessarily restrict entry anymore. Employment laws relating to the closed shop changed, well, decades ago under Thatcher. Let's look about work visas. Again, I'm trying to pick out here topical issues that might be relevant to your exam. So work visas in the UK do play a key role by allowing skilled overseas workers to enter a country and help to fill labour shortages, particularly in industries where there's maybe a lack of domestic workers with the necessary skills. This chart is particularly interesting. It shows the number of work visas granted in the UK since 2011. Now, keep in mind, of course, that the UK left the European Union at the end of 2019 into 2020, 5 years ago now. And one of the features of the European Union is free movement within and across member nations. And the UK has replaced free movement with a points-based work immigration platform and a greater use of work visas. And you can see what's happened. From 114,000 in 2020, a figure artificially low because of the pandemic, they've surged to over 600,000 in the last 2 years, and that's per year. So there's been a huge rise in work visas. Well, again, thinking about labour demand and supply, how might we use a diagram to analyse work visa policy? Here's a market showing the demand for and supply of skilled construction workers. Equivalent wage is pretty high. Let's assume, for example, there's a big rise in labour demand, perhaps because the UK government is trying to encourage new house building or the building of new reservoirs, expansion of motorways and bypasses and so on, schools and hospitals. So there could be a cyclical rise in demand for labour, which in theory drives wages up. And of course that can add to costs. Well, work visas, if you increase the number of visas allowed, if you relax your policy and allow construction firms to import labour, then if the UK government expands the work visa quotas, then we see an outward shift of labour supply. I've also made it slightly more elastic if you perhaps relax some of the wage demands or qualifications needed to work in the industry. But if the labour supply curve shifts out, then in theory that brings wages down and employment up. Well, how we're using this diagram, the diagram shows that work visas are a way of hoping to relieve labour shortages and reduce the pressure on wage inflation in certain industries. UK government's targeting to build 1.5 million homes over the next 5 years. Well, good luck with that. This chart shows how many houses have actually been completed in the UK since the sort of post-war period. The grey bit is local authorities, council housing, housing associations in black there, and private enterprise in blue. And private enterprise has dominated now for the last essentially 40 years. But 1.5 million homes for each of the next 5 years. The last time we built 300,000 new homes was 1977. And I remember it because I was there. What about AI? Again, let's think about how we can use diagrams perhaps with a question on artificial intelligence. There is, and there will be, a boom in artificial intelligence in the UK. It's worth thinking about how this might affect demand for labour in different jobs. On the one hand, some jobs will be in higher demand, particularly in technology and AI-related occupations. So AI specialists, machine learning engineers, people who help develop, train and maintain AI systems. Data scientists, people who can interpret and manage data effectively, will be in increased demand. And so too software developers and engineers to drive AI applications. There could be an increase in demand for AI-assisted medical professions, people who are expert in using AI-enhanced diagnostic technologies. And also things like AI content creation in the media. So some jobs will see higher demand. On the other hand, it's likely, it's probably happening already, that demand for routine and repetitive jobs, data entry, processing roles, will go down. Perhaps the AI-powered kiosk will reduce demand for cashiers in bricks and mortar retail stores. We're seeing AI-driven robotics, the likes of Ocado and Amazon, automating repetitive tasks. So perhaps there'll be a fall in demand for jobs in warehouses and logistics, customer services and call centres, so on and so forth. So AI is clearly going to change the labour market. It's going to cause changing labour demand in certain jobs. Now, one way of approaching this in an exam is to use a double diagram. On the one hand, some jobs will go up in demand. So the demand for data scientists will increase, potentially driving up their equilibrium wages and employment. Whereas on the other hand, demand for warehouse staff might fall, leading to a fall in employment and perhaps a fall in wages. So here's a nice way of just splitting up the market. Instead of just using one diagram, draw two diagrams side by side for specific occupations. And it's a good way, a nice clean way of using labour demand and labour supply to make your point. Minimum wage is another topic. The next two charts that will appear on your screen show what has happened to the minimum wage for younger and adult workers in the labour market. And the minimum wage for under 18s, having stayed more or less between £3 and £4 between 2004 and 2017, has risen quite sharply in recent times, in part, of course, because of the cost of living crisis. It'll be £7.55 from April 2025 onwards. And the overall living wage, it's not a living wage, but it's called the National Living Wage by the government, that again has gone up from £8.72 for adult workers to £12.21 from the spring of 2025. So clearly the minimum wage is a very topical issue. For a minimum wage to be effective, of course, it must be set above the free market wage. So W2 could be a minimum wage. And again, in theory, that encourages more people to offer themselves for work. It improves labour incentives, but it can cause a contraction of labour demand from E1 to E3. Now, that's fine. That diagram is absolutely fine in an exam, but examiners are now looking for you to develop the diagram to build a slightly more sophisticated analysis. One way to do that is to change the elasticity of demand. So here's a slightly more labour wage inelastic labour demand curve, LD2. And you can see if that's the case, the same minimum wage of W2, we don't get quite as big a fall in employment as you did before. Employment falls from E1 to E4 instead of from E1 to E3. And some people argue that a minimum wage going up can increase demand for labour, in particular if workers become more productive and if there's an increase in spending power of people on low wages who typically have a high propensity to spend. So you could develop the diagram further by saying, well, actually there could be an increase in labour demand, which in theory means that employment can remain at E1 even at the prevailing minimum wage. So this is quite a good way of just developing your diagram, a shift in labour demand, a change in the elasticity of the demand curve. Develop your diagram for higher analysis and evaluation marks. Now, if you have any questions that you want to pose about this video, please do put them in the comments section of the video and I'll do my best to respond. I hope you found this video useful. Stay happy, stay curious. See you sometime soon.